Welcome back to Telltale. This video I'm going to talk about a very, very early work of H.G. Wells. I know everybody else I'm doing these videos kind of in order. H.G. Wells, I'm all over the place, and I'm not even doing videos about everything, but I am reading through all of his work, trying to stay in chronological order of publication. And so before I ever even started doing Telltale, I had started reading Wells and had read a lot of his works. Most of the short stories were written before 1900, in the period of like 1887 to 1901. That's when most of his short stories were written. And his first few stories weren't really science fiction, and they're not bad. They're enjoyable to read, but they're definitely not what you expect from H.G. Wells. They're more anecdotal, and a lot of them are not science fiction or fantasy at all. So the first one that I come upon that I'm interested in, and which I think is of consequence to the casual reader discovering Wells, is called the Chronic Argonauts. Now, the Time Machine was published in 1895, if I'm not mistaken. The Chronic Argonauts was published in the journal of the school where Wells was teaching. The Science Schools Journal, it was called, in 1888. And you might be able to guess from the Chronic Argonauts that it has to do with time travel, chronic. And yes, it is actually the first version of the Time Machine. But it's way, way different from... If you've read The Time Machine, the Chronic Argonauts is just completely different. Now, Wells never actually finished the Chronic Argonauts. He was serializing it. He published, I believe, 3 parts in the Science Schools Journal from April to June of 1888, sorry. And then he abandoned it because he really didn't like where he was going with it. He really didn't think it was good enough. Now, I think it's a pretty darn good story, especially for such an early effort, and at a time when this type of story, nothing like it existed at all. He was inventing a new genre here. So he very easily could have said, oh, this is great, and kept going and finished it off, and that would have been the end of it. And it still would have stood as a landmark in the history of literature, although not a particularly great landmark, because it's not as good as the final Time Machine novel that he would publish. And he actually... He wrote this story. He wrote a version of The Time Machine later on for a magazine. He rewrote it for another magazine. He rewrote it again for the first publication with Heinemann. And then he rewrote it again in 1923. So he was constantly revising that book. Anyway, this story... Unlike the Time Machine, where you have the narrative being told from the point of view of the time traveler through one of his friends, this one starts out where, and there's actually a name given to the character, although it's one I can't pronounce. It's a really weird name. All the place names are really weird. The people's names are mostly very odd. And I think that is a problem because it makes it... They might be proper Welsh names, because I know Welsh is very different from English. But it makes it seem like he's not being serious, like he's being silly to the modern American reader. Anyway, the story starts out being told in the third person omniscient narrative, mainly viewing things from the point of view of the townspeople, where they're all noticing this strange guy comes and buys this dilapidated old house and starts having all this weird machinery delivered there. This story feels a lot more gothic than the Final Time Machine novel. And it also, the writing doesn't flow well. The writing seems a little clunky and a bit wordy. He hasn't really found his style with this stuff yet, which really brings this story down. But if you can fight through those things, if you can fight through the fact that it was very early, if you can fight through the fact that his ideas were still not coming together yet when he was writing this, if you can get past the fact that it's not even finished, it's worth reading. It's worth checking out. If you really love H.G. Wells, it's worth checking this story out. For historical reasons, it's worth reading. And it is an interesting story. Like I say, a lot more gothic than much of what I've read by Wells, which is interesting. I read something where he was trying to imitate Nathaniel Hawthorne's style when he wrote this story. So you can find Chronic Argonauts plenty of places. You can find it online for free. I have this book. It's the Norton Critical Edition of the Time Machine. It's nice because it's annotated. There's footnotes that explain a lot of things and give some interesting behind the scenes. And it's got the Chronic Argonauts as well as the Time Machine in that book. So from here, I wanted to go back and cover this because I didn't. Read this about 5 years ago in my beginning of exploring H.G. Wells. And next I move on to Mankind in the Making. I've actually been trying to get to that book for over a year now. And I'm gonna dig in and I'm gonna get it done. It's kind of a sequel to Anticipations, which was a brilliant nonfiction work by Wells. Mankind in the Making, again, is nonfiction. It's his ideas. It's an idea book. And haven't read it yet. Haven't ever read it before. This will be my first time through it. I'm hoping it'll be just as good as Anticipations was. So follow me on this journey through H.G. Wells. I've got some great stuff coming up. I've got that one. I still got to get to Food of the Gods, In the Days of the Comet, A Modern Utopia. I already did The War in the Air, a little out of order, but that's okay. And like and subscribe to us. We'll have a lot of other videos, not just H.G. Wells. I'm following Harlan Ellison and J.G. Ballard and Jack Williamson and H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe and Philip K. Dick. We're deeply into Philip K. Dick already. And Emily's joining me on that one. And William Hope Hodgson. Come back for a lot more great discussions of great works of literature. And I promise we're going to get into some stuff that's not so science fictional. I've been realizing we're very focused on science fiction and horror this year in 2022. I said to Emily, for 2023, I really want to get into some some traditional classics, things like Little Women and Thomas Hardy and Nathaniel Hawthorne and Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck, some of the great popular authors. Get some of that on this channel too. So till next time, man, we'll join us.